issues I've been talking about in these videos, there's a running theme which is something about what references are for and how we refer to the literature. And what I want to do briefly is to talk about what the referencing system is. What we call academic norms are embodied in this process where we draw upon previous literature and we cite the work of people who've gone before. And the question I want to look at now is why and who is it for? Now you can think about this as a process whereby you're making a case, you're presenting an argument, and you are going to call upon people to lend your argument support, and they can lend that support in one of a number of ways. So you might see citing a reference as being like calling a witness in court. You're making a case and you want independent evidence to support your case. You might bring in people who say something that you've said is the case is the case. They may offer a definition or a framework that makes life easier for you. They may have already described a way of looking at the world so that you don't need to do it again. They've clarified an issue so that you don't need to make further efforts in clarifying, and they may present an alternative case that you're arguing against. In any of those cases, when you call a witness to your support, the question arises, who is the witness? You don't just, any old body that I've pulled off the street will tell you this is the case. If anybody knows it and everybody knows it, there's no need to call a witness. If they're offering you a framework of analysis, then the next question is, who are they? Certainly, but what is the framework of analysis? You need to do more than simply drop a name in there. And the same applies if they're presenting an alternative case that you're going to argue against. Again, you still need to say who they are, why this is a case worth arguing against, and what it means in terms of your argument. Just dropping a name in at the end of a sentence doesn't do any good in terms of these reasons for putting in a citation. Certainly there are some cases where if you want evidence that there are 6 million bicycles in Beijing, plain fact, you might simply just drop one name in. But in any other case where the citation is contributing more fully to your case, you need to develop it in the text more fully than just a name at the end of a sentence. Why? Who is it for? Who are these references for? This is a delicate question, I think, because there are two groups of people that the references might be for. Part of the reason that you're putting citations into your work is to show what you've read. It's to bolster your authority as an author. You're putting citations in there to show that you've understood the background literature that you're citing, that you're reading, you've read the topics around, you've read the literature around your topic. But the other group of people that the citations are there for are your readers. Your readers may want to follow up. You may mention a framework of analysis that they don't know anything about, but they want to know more about because of the way you've described it. But for that to work properly, you have to have given enough of a description of what the framework is about in order to interest your readers. Your readers need to better decide whether they want to follow up on the citations or whether they don't want to follow up on the citations. So again, simply dropping a name in isn't enough. You need to explain why and who the person is that you're citing, so that the readers can say, oh, that sounds interesting, I want to know more, or okay, I know enough, I'm not going to follow up on that. And that's quite apart from your need to express your authority, your support for your authority by using citations. There is a third reason, I think, why you might, for whom you're providing background for your readers. If you write an essay in history, the background, the literature that you are referring to is understood. If you write an essay in geography, the background literature is probably understood by professional geographers. In education, we're not quite so easily, we can't identify our background so easily. The background may be psychological, the background may be sociological, the background may be pedagogical. There are a host of different backgrounds that your work might be set in. And by using citations, you're able to provide a setting for your work. How you want your work to be read. Do you want it to be read as philosophical, psychological, sociological? You're giving, again, your readers a context in which to evaluate your work. In many subject areas, that background might be taken for granted, but I think that in education, it's not so easily taken for granted. So in view of these different reasons and different audiences for your citations that you put into papers, I want to introduce you to a little discussion that I had some years ago through the columns of a national newspaper on higher education. In 1987, I wrote a review of this book, The Making of Soviet Citizens, edited by George Avis. The review was published in the Times Higher Education Supplement. Here's the page from the 4th of December 1987, and the bottom, roughly a bottom third of the page, is my review. Quite a long review, quite detailed, and towards the end of the review I made this observation. Unfortunately though, the authors are all Russian readers and, with a notable exception, they cite works in Russian. For those who do not read the language, this makes the book less useful as an introduction to Soviet education. Now, I might have phrased that more felicitously, but the point that I was making was that if the readers, and the book was in English, so the readers are presumed to be readers in English, for the readers to be able to follow up on interesting points and to dig into the background information that the authors were pointing to, it would have been better had those footnotes been in English than if they had been in Russian. However, that provoked a rather angry response from one of the contributors, and 3 weeks later, 25th of December 1987, a letter to the editor was published by the same publication. In that response, the contributor to the volume connects the review to a story that was also in the same issue about shortages of language skills in university courses, and he says of me, "Your reviewer, a lecturer in the School of Independent Study, believes it unfortunate that the authors can read Russian, since this makes the book less useful." Now, I didn't actually say that, because what I said was it made it less useful to the readers. The readers could not be presumed to read Russian. Of course, it's beneficial that the authors read Russian and understand the system that they're describing. What else would be the case? How reassuring for the non-Russian speaker. If the authors had saved themselves the bother of learning Russian and of travelling to the USSR in order to talk to children, teachers and administrators in Russian, they would have produced a more useful book, which would have been based entirely on second-hand opinions of others. That's, of course, a defence against a case that I had not made, but it's important to see that here the author of this letter can only see footnotes as a tool for the authors. It's for the authors to establish their bona fides. It's for the authors to show that they know the subject. And I'm arguing that's not the only reason that we have footnotes. In fact, 80% of the reason for having footnotes, I still claim that 80% of the reason for having footnotes is for the benefit of the readers, so that the readers can follow up on the things that they've found interesting. I have to say, I also think he overstates the case, the need for languages in order to understand another country's educational system. Language is an advantage, of course, and no one's denying that it helps if you speak the language. But it's not the only way of understanding other people. It's not possible to speak every language and to understand every language in order to be able to understand other people. And I think at this time, back in the 1970s and 1980s, there was perhaps an overemphasis on the value of language in understanding other people's systems rather than an understanding of systems per se. So there's a discussion, a debate to be had here. I'm not saying I expressed myself well in the debate, but I want you to look at what the footnotes are there for. And in many ways, one of the major purposes of footnotes is so that someone reading an article can decide what's of interest to them and can go and pursue it through further reading, which is recommended by the authors. Now, another instance of this is perhaps a book that I might refer to here. My PhD supervisor was a great fan of the work of Karl Popper, and in particular the poverty of historicism. And one of the reasons that he advocated that we look at the book, that we look at the poverty of historicism, was this. Here's an image of a page of the poverty of historicism, and you'll note that you don't need to be able to read any of the text in order to see that the top half of the page is the narrative that is being given by the author, and the bottom half of the page is footnotes and references which present the detail of the debate, the discussion, the evidence, counter-arguments to the counter-arguments, and that there's a whole lot going on in the footnotes which is not necessary in order to be able to read the text. You can read the text as a story, the subtext can be left for when you come back and look at it in more detail. And what my PhD supervisor was pointing to was the fact that in an academic piece of work, the story, the main thrust of the argument can be fairly simple, but it needs to be backed up with references, with discussion, debate, teasing out the finer points. And it should be like a swan, where the swan is serene on the surface and all of the paddling is going on under the water. And the powerhouse of the argument is happening behind the scenes. And my concern with the way that people are using references at the moment is that they're serene on the surface, but there's not that sense that there's the powerhouse of depth going on underneath the surface. Here's an example of a paragraph from a journal that came through the mail to me only this week. And in this paragraph, the authors are talking about the marketization of higher education. And they're talking about the difficulty of the nuance of defining marketization as it relates to higher education. The specific context is an article about marketization of higher education focusing on the USA and Turkey. And here in this paragraph there are 4 references. Two of them are to PhD theses written about marketisation in China. There's a lack of connection between who is being cited, what is being cited, and the arguments being presented in this article. And it's strange because over the page there's another paragraph where authors who are widely published and well known for writing about marketisation in higher education are cited. For some reason they've not been used to define and discuss the definition of marketisation. They've been left for a later discussion. But in both cases what we've got is just a name dropped in at the end of the paragraph, at the end of a sentence. There's a sentence that makes a statement and then just the name dropped in at the end. Now of course in some cases that will be relevant. That will be if there's a detail that you just want to support for, if you just want to or witness that a particular fact is true, then a name at the end of a sentence is appropriate. But where you're talking about definition of one of the key concepts of the paper, what should be done is to present the substance of the discussion. What was it that this particular author argued? What was counter-argued by another author? So that the important citations, the citations that are central to the argument, enough detail is given so that your reader can go off and find out what has been said. And in that sense, what I think would be an improvement would be to see fewer citations used, but to see those few citations that are used employed much better in order to make the case, to give the reader enough information so that they can decide whether they believe the arguments or not simply have those cases asserted. So what I'm arguing here is for a better use of footnotes and references in the aid of the reader, and to shift the emphasis in using references to the thought, what does the reader need in order to understand this?